Imagine it is the 1st of December 2001. You are a 44-year-old dentist living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your name is Eduardo. You have a small practice in the Palermo neighborhood. The waiting room has 6 chairs and a potted plant your wife picked out. A framed certificate from the Universidad de Buenos Aires hangs on the wall where you graduated in 1981. You have worked for 20 years to build what you have. Your apartment is paid off. Your 2 children are in secondary school. Your bank account holds the equivalent of 43,000 US dollars. In Argentina at that time, that means 43,000 pesos. This is because the government has tied the 2 currencies together at exactly 1-to-1. The peso equals the dollar. The government says so, the billboards say so, the newspapers say so. You believe it. You have no reason not to. Every Saturday morning, you walk to the Banco de la Nación branch 4 blocks from your apartment. You deposit that week's earnings. You shake hands with the same teller you have used for 11 years. You walk home feeling like a man who has done everything right. You have done everything they told you to do. You saved. You did not gamble. You did not speculate. You trusted the system. You trusted the bank. You trusted the peso. On the morning of December 3rd, 2001, you walk to the bank and the doors are locked. There's a handwritten sign taped to the glass. It says, "Accounts are frozen. You can withdraw no more than 250 pesos per week. That is about $250. Your 43,000 pesos are inside that building, and you cannot touch them. 2 months later, those 43,000 pesos will be worth the equivalent of about $14,000. The government has decided to devalue the currency. Your savings, which took 20 years to build, have just lost more than 66% of their value, overnight, by decree. You did nothing wrong, you broke no law, you simply trusted a system that was designed to protect you. And when that system chose to save itself, it used your savings to do it. If you have ever wondered why some people come through financial collapse with their lives intact, while others lose everything despite doing all the right things, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has repeated itself across dozens of countries over the past century, and it always ends the same way for those who are not prepared. Today, we are going to look at 5 types of assets. History shows governments have the hardest time taking them from ordinary people. This is not financial advice, this is historical analysis. If you find value in this kind of clarity, subscribing to this channel takes 2 seconds. It costs nothing. And it puts you ahead of what most people will never see coming. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Eduardo's story is not unique. It is not even rare. It is one of the most repeated economic stories in modern history. Different countries, different decades, different names on the doors of the banks, but the same architecture, the same mechanism, the same result. Here is the core of it. And it is simpler than most people think. Every government in history has faced the same temptation when it runs out of money. It looks around for the nearest pool of value it can reach, and the nearest pool of value is almost always the savings of its own citizens, the savings they trusted to banks, the pensions they trusted to the state, the currency they trusted because a government told them to. Think of it like this. Imagine you built a great sandcastle on the beach. You poured hours of work into it, but the castle is built close enough to the water. When the tide comes in, it does not need to knock it down deliberately. The water simply rises quietly, and the castle dissolves. Your savings in a bank account denominated in a government-controlled currency are that sandcastle. They sit inside a government-regulated institution. When the tide of a financial crisis rises, those savings are accessible. They are reachable. They are within range of the water. The 5 assets we are going to discuss today are not sandcastles. They are things that sit further up the beach. They are harder to reach, harder to freeze, harder to devalue, and harder to seize. History does not guarantee anything, but history repeatedly shows that certain things have been much harder for governments to take than others. This brings us directly to the first of them. The first asset is something no government has ever figured out how to seize. It cannot be frozen. It cannot be devalued. No decree can remove it from your possession. It has no account number. It sits in no vault. It exists entirely inside you. We are talking about skills and specialized knowledge. Economists call this human capital. It simply means the productive power that lives in your mind and your hands. This might sound obvious, but the history of how this worked in practice is extraordinary, and most people do not know it. Let us go back to Germany in the early 1920s. The Weimar Republic was entering one of the worst economic collapses in modern history. The German mark was losing value at an extreme speed. By November 1923, it took 4,210 billion marks to buy a single US dollar. To understand what that means, consider everyday life. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1914 cost 200 billion marks by late 1923. People were bringing wheelbarrows full of cash to buy groceries. Not because they were rich, because the cash was so worthless that you needed a wheelbarrow to carry enough of it. In this environment, the savings of ordinary middle-class Germans were destroyed. completely. A retired schoolteacher who spent 40 years saving watched his nest egg become worthless. It happened in about 18 months. The savings were real. The work was real. But the vehicle holding the savings, the German mark, was a promise the government could no longer keep. But here is what history records. Some people still kept their productive capacity. Doctors still had patients. Engineers still had bridges to build. Skilled craftsmen still had trades to practice. A German physician in 1923 could not eat his savings, but he could treat patients and get paid in whatever held value at the time. Sometimes that was foreign currency. Sometimes it was food or barter goods. The skill itself was unaffected by the collapse of the currency. His ability to earn remained intact. His ability to produce value and exchange it was independent of what the government printed on its banknotes. This pattern appeared again in the 1930s. Political persecution forced hundreds of thousands of professionals to flee Europe. Many of them left with almost nothing. Jewish physicians, architects, engineers, lawyers, and scientists left Germany. They had virtually no physical assets. Yet many rebuilt their economic lives in new countries within a few years, not because they had money, but because their knowledge went with them. It crossed every border. It was subject to no capital controls. No government decree could confiscate a surgeon's training. No law could confiscate a mathematician's understanding. The knowledge was inseparable from the person. This is not a metaphor. It is documented economic history. Human capital cannot be frozen in a bank account. It cannot be devalued by printing more of it. It cannot be seized by decree, when everything else can be taken or locked or devalued. What lives in your head and your hands remains yours. Societies that understand this invest deeply in education and skill. People who lived through crises in Argentina, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela report the same pattern. Those with portable skills were not trapped. They had options. They could earn anywhere. And when you can earn anywhere, you cannot truly be made destitute. Now, here's something I want you to think about before we go further. Every government in history that has faced a financial crisis has frozen bank accounts, devalued currencies, or seized deposits, every single one. But in all of recorded economic history, no government has ever passed a law that successfully made a skilled surgeon into an unskilled person, or turned a trained engineer's knowledge to zero. What does that tell you about where real wealth actually lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I am genuinely curious what you think. And because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story most people never hear. It involves one of the most trusted governments in the world. It happened in one of the most stable economic periods in modern history, and it used the full force of law to take something people believed was theirs. And it worked, mostly. This leads us to the second part of this story: physical precious metals, specifically gold, held entirely outside the banking system. Here's a piece of history that surprises almost everyone when they first hear it. On April 5th, 1933, the President of the United States signed Executive Order 6102. The president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The order required almost all U.S. citizens to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates. They had to give them to the Federal Reserve. Failure to comply was considered a federal crime. The penalty was up to 10 years in prison. There was also a fine of up to $10,000. In today's terms, that fine would be roughly $168,000. The government paid citizens $20.67 per troy ounce for their gold. That was the official price. Citizens were told surrendering gold was a patriotic duty during a national emergency. The Great Depression was devastating the country. Banks were collapsing. Unemployment had reached 25%. The government said it needed to stabilize the currency and strengthen the banking system. Here is the part of the story most history classes skip. Within months of collecting the gold, the government changed its value. After paying citizens $20.67 per ounce, the Roosevelt administration revalued gold. The new price became $35 per ounce. The government had just bought your gold for $20.67. Then it immediately priced it at $35. That is a gain of roughly 69%, and that gain went entirely to the government. Every citizen who complied lost value. Around 40% of their wealth silently shifted to the state. This did not happen through robbery. It happened through repricing, through a single policy decision, a simple signature on a document. More than 2,600 metric tons of gold were collected. But here is the surprising part. Despite harsh penalties, enforcement was extremely rare. Only a small number of people were prosecuted. Historians believe large amounts of gold were never surrendered. Many people quietly kept their gold privately. Those who kept it outside banks and government records preserved their purchasing power. The government could not easily find or reach it. For the next 41 years, Americans were not legally allowed to own gold. That ban lasted until December 31st, 1974. Privately held gold remained outside the system. It stayed invisible and untouched by policy. The mechanism here is important to understand. A government can only seize what it can find. Gold stored in a bank is recorded in documents. It appears in ledgers and forms. That kind of gold is easy to locate, but gold hidden privately is very different. Gold in a private safe has no official record. With no paper trail, it becomes extremely difficult to trace. This is not an argument for illegal behavior. It is simply a historical observation. Assets held outside formal systems are harder to reach, especially compared to assets inside those systems. Consider Venezuela between 2016 and 2018. Inflation exploded beyond comprehension. In 2016, inflation reached 800%. In 2017, it rose above 4,000%. By 2018, inflation was nearly 1,700,000%. The national currency, the bolivar, collapsed rapidly. It became worthless faster than it could be printed. People with savings in bolivars watched their wealth disappear, but people holding small amounts of physical gold survived better. Even tiny pieces preserved value. A 10th-ounce coin could buy food. A ring or bracelet could still hold purchasing power. The gold itself did not change. What changed was the currency collapsing around it. Gold is not a perfect solution. Governments have attempted to confiscate it before. The 1933 example clearly proves that. But physical gold outside financial systems has historically been harder to reach. Across many crises and centuries, it remained one of the most resilient forms of wealth. Gold exists in physical reality. It does not depend on a bank. It does not depend on government promises. It is not a financial agreement. It is a tangible object. Now look closely at what all these cases share. In Argentina, in 2001, the destroyed savings were inside banks. In Cyprus, in 2013, the seized funds were inside specific banks above certain limits. In Weimar Germany in 1923, the wiped out savings were held in government currency. In every example, the assets were inside a controlled system. That system made them reachable. A bank account needs a bank. A currency needs a government. A bond requires a treasury. These structures make assets visible and accessible. Every wealth confiscation in history followed this principle. The asset had to depend on an institution. Its value existed because a system guaranteed it. Without that guarantee, the asset had no protection. Most people never realize this. They trust systems simply because those systems have always worked. They have never experienced a bank closure. They have never seen a handwritten notice on locked doors. If you are still listening, you are different. You are not most people. Hit subscribe if you want to understand the rest of this analysis, because the next part is where things get even more interesting. It is the part textbooks rarely discuss. It is where geography becomes the most powerful financial tool. This brings us to the third asset. To understand it properly, we must travel to Cyprus in the spring of 2013. Cyprus is a small island nation. It is also a member of the European Union. By 2013, its banking sector had become enormous. The banks held far more money than the country's economy produced. Cypriot banks had around 70 billion euros in deposits, but the country's total annual economic output was only 18 billion euros. The banks had taken huge risks. Most of those risks involved Greek government bonds. Those bets collapsed disastrously. The banks were suddenly facing massive losses. In March 2013, European Union officials stepped in. The Cypriot government negotiated an emergency agreement. To receive a 10 billion euro bailout, Cyprus had to take an unprecedented step. It would take money directly from bank depositors. Not from shareholders, not from bond investors, from ordinary depositors, from people who simply trusted banks to protect their money. At Laiki Bank, deposits above 100,000 euros were moved into what officials called a bad bank. Those deposits were essentially wiped out. At the Bank of Cyprus, the largest bank, deposits above 100,000 euros were converted into bank shares. 47.5% of the value disappeared. Those shares represented ownership in a failing bank. In reality, that was nearly the same as losing the money entirely. Someone with 200,000 euros in the Bank of Cyprus woke up normally on March 25, 2013. By the end of that day, they had roughly 100,000 euros left. Many people gathered in bank lobbies in shock. Some were crying openly. Others stared silently at the numbers. They could not believe what had happened. Retirees had spent decades saving that money. Business owners had kept operating capital in those accounts. None of them had broken the law. None had done anything wrong. But their savings were inside a system the government could reach. And at the wrong moment, that system took them. Here is the chilling detail that emerged in later investigations. In the weeks before the bail-in was announced, an estimated 4.5 billion euros in deposits were moved out of Cypriot banks by individuals who had advanced knowledge of what was coming. Reports and parliamentary investigations suggested that well-connected individuals, including people with ties to government and banking officials, had transferred money offshore before the controls were put in place. Once the controls arrived, they did not apply to money that was already gone. The asset had moved beyond the jurisdiction before the jurisdiction could act on it. Now observe the same pattern in Lebanon. In October 2019, Lebanese banks began imposing informal capital controls. Depositors were told they could no longer freely transfer dollars abroad. But in the months before those controls arrived, estimates suggest that several $billion were quietly moved offshore by those with the right connections and the right information. People who had assets in bank accounts outside Lebanon, in Switzerland, in Cyprus, or in the United States held onto them entirely. The deposits inside Lebanese banks by 2023 had been effectively trapped at a grossly devalued exchange rate. They lost the vast majority of their value in real terms. A dollar inside a Lebanese bank in 2019 was worth very little by 2023. A dollar that had already been moved to a bank account in another country was still worth a dollar. The asset in this case is not the foreign currency itself. It is the geography. Assets held in foreign jurisdictions in politically stable countries with strong rule of law have historically proven to be outside the reach of domestic crises. Domestic assets simply do not have that same protection. The Argentine investor who held an apartment in Montevideo, Uruguay in 2001 was not subject to the corralito. The Cypriot depositor who had moved funds to Germany in February 2013 did not lose 47.5% in March. The Lebanese professional who held a savings account in France before October 2019 watched the crisis from a safe financial distance. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Look at what we have seen in 3 completely different countries in 3 completely different decades. The same mechanism appears again and again. In the United States, in 1933, the government reached into a system it controlled and collected gold that was registered, documented, and traceable. The gold that was outside that system proved significantly harder to collect. In Cyprus in 2013, the government reached into a banking system it controlled and took deposits above a certain size. The deposits that had already left the system were untouchable. In Lebanon from 2019 onward, informal capital controls trapped value that sat inside domestic banks. Meanwhile, value that had already moved to foreign institutions sat beyond reach. The same mechanism appeared across different countries and decades. Governments can take what is inside the systems they control. They struggle enormously with what is already outside those systems. The assets that survive are the ones that, at the critical moment, are not in the room where the decision is being made. And this is where history becomes uncomfortable. Because the question is not just about which assets are hard to reach. It is also about who bears the cost when governments reach as far as they can and still need more. The answer to that question has been the same in virtually every financial crisis in history. The middle class bears it. Not the very poor, because the very poor have little to take. Not the very wealthy, because the very wealthy have the resources and connections to move their assets before the doors close. The cost falls with extraordinary consistency on the middle class. The savers and disciplined workers are the ones most exposed. These are the people who followed every instruction and trusted every institution. They are often the ones who pay the price. In Argentina, in 2001 and 2002, the people most devastated by the corralito were middle-class professionals. Teachers, doctors, small business owners, and accountants. They had done exactly what a responsible adult is supposed to do. They had saved their money and used the banking system. They trusted the currency their government guaranteed. Yet suddenly, those savings were locked behind doors they could not open. Meanwhile, wealthy Argentines who diversified into foreign currencies or overseas property survived the crisis far better. Some held real estate in Miami or Madrid. Others kept funds in offshore bank accounts. Their assets existed outside the reach of the Argentine government's emergency measures. Because of that, they largely came through the crisis intact. Location and asset type made the difference. In Weimar Germany in 1923, the savings of the German middle class were destroyed by hyperinflation. Bank accounts lost their value rapidly. A lifetime of work became worthless within months, but landowners still had farmland. Farmers could still produce crops. Those crops still had real value regardless of the currency collapse. Factories also continued producing goods. Machinery still functioned and created products people needed. Real assets continued generating value even while the currency collapsed. The fourth asset in this story is productive land with tangible output. Land that produces food, timber, or mineral resources. These assets hold value because they create something real. This stability comes from physical reality rather than financial promises. The land still exists, and the soil still produces crops. People still need food regardless of monetary policy. During the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the ruble savings of millions disappeared almost overnight. State pensions lost their value and the currency system destabilized. Yet families with small garden plots called dakas had something real. Those families could grow food and trade what they produced. The physical output of land cannot be devalued by a central bank. It exists outside the financial system. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that clearly. The real question is whether people are paying attention. If this channel helps you see patterns others ignore, subscribe. It costs nothing. But the knowledge could matter one day. Now look again at the people who survived these crises best. They were not necessarily richer before the crisis. They simply made decisions earlier. Years before the crisis arrived, they placed part of their wealth outside vulnerable systems. They diversified location, asset type, or currency. And that decision made all the difference. In Argentina, many survivors of the 2001 Corralito had converted savings into physical US dollars kept at home. They did this before the government froze bank accounts. Their decision protected their purchasing power. Argentina had already experienced similar crises in 1975, 1985, and 1989. The pattern was visible to anyone who studied history. Those who prepared had simply paid attention. In Germany, those who survived the Weimar hyperinflation often held foreign currencies like British pounds or US dollars. Others held land, goods, or real assets with intrinsic value. Those tangible assets protected them when the currency collapsed. They had not been told to do this by any financial advisor. Many of them had lived through the previous German inflation after the First World War and understood, from direct experience, that paper promises from governments were exactly that, promises. And promises can be broken. The fifth asset that history identifies as consistently hard for governments to reach is a combination of the others, seen through a different lens. It is diversification across uncorrelated, physically distinct asset types. A person who held some skills, some physical metal, some foreign currency, and some real property in a stable jurisdiction never had everything in the same place at the same time. When the banking system was seized, their gold was fine. When their home currency was devalued, their foreign savings were fine. When their country descended into chaos, their skills still worked in a different country. No single government action could reach all of it simultaneously. This is not a sophisticated financial strategy. It does not require being wealthy. Historical accounts from Argentina, Lebanon, and Weimar Germany consistently show middle-class individuals who achieved this kind of diversification with modest means. A small amount of physical gold, a second skill with international applicability, a modest bank account in a neighboring stable country. None of these things require being a millionaire. All of them require understanding the historical pattern and making decisions before the moment of crisis arrives. Because by the time the crisis is visible, the doors are already being locked. The 250 peso a week sign is already being written. Now let us go back to Eduardo, the dentist in Buenos Aires. In the version of his story that history actually recorded for many people like him, December 3rd, 2001 was the last day of his financial life as he had known it. The 43,000 pesos became 14,000 equivalent dollars over the following weeks. The years of work did not disappear from his memory or his character, but the store of value he had placed inside the system was gone. Not by theft in any recognizable sense, but by the machinery of a government that had exhausted its options and reached for the nearest available pool of savings. There were other people in Buenos Aires that same morning. Some of them walked to the same bank, read the same sign, and felt the same cold in their stomach. But they had less in those accounts than Eduardo did. They had the rest spread differently. Some in American dollars in an envelope in a drawer, some in an apartment in Montevideo, some in a skill that the Argentine crisis did not change. Their loss was real, but it was not total. This is what history teaches us about financial resilience, not that you can predict exactly what will happen or when. Not that any single asset is perfectly safe forever, but that assets, which exist outside the systems that governments directly control, have historically been much harder to reach. Skills cannot be devalued by decree. Physical metals held privately leave no entry in a ledger for a regulator to act on. Property in a different jurisdiction sits beyond domestic emergency measures. Productive land still produces, and diversification across all of them means that no single action can reach everything at once. This video is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Tax laws, property laws, and financial regulations vary by country and change over time. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision based on anything discussed in this or any other video. But if there is one thing the historical record of the past 100 years makes clear, it is this. The governments that have taken the most from ordinary people have done it through the systems those ordinary people trusted the most. The bank is the most trusted institution most people have. The national currency is the most trusted financial instrument most people hold. And in crisis after crisis, those trusted systems have been the first thing reached for and the last thing protected. The people who came through with their lives intact were not lucky. They were early. They understood that the safest place for some part of your wealth is always somewhere that requires more than a pen, a decree, or a locked door to reach. This video is not for everyone. Most people will watch it and move on. A few will sit with it for a while. If there is one person in your life who needs to hear this story, who needs to understand what happened to Eduardo, to the Cypriot depositors, to the savers of Weimar Germany, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, but because it might change their world. Subscribe for more of this kind of historical analysis, and I will see you in the next one.